Welcome particularly to those who weren't with us for this morning's session. You're most welcome. So this is the SCURL Collections and Metadata Group mini conference, and this afternoon's session is all on the theme of transforming access. And so we've got an interesting and exciting set of papers ahead of us. I should also introduce myself for those who weren't here this morning. I'm Joe Marshall. I'm Associate Director of Collections Management at the National Library of Scotland and also Chair of the SCURL Collections and Metadata Group. And very pleased to see you all today. And welcome back to those who are with us for a really interesting discussion this morning. So just to reiterate some of the housekeeping that we confirmed this morning, so you will find that you've been muted, and please keep yourselves muted and your cameras turned off unless you're speaking. And if you have got questions at any point during the proceedings, please put those in the Q&A rather than the chat, and we can use the chat for general conversation and dialogue about the weather, as I can see people are doing right now. We will have questions after each block, so we're going to move into the showcase sessions very shortly, and when we finish the showcase sessions we'll take questions at that point. So it now gives me great pleasure to introduce Simon Baines. So Simon is University Librarian and Head of Library Services at Aberdeen. He arrived at Aberdeen in 2019 from the University of Manchester, where he had been Deputy Librarian and Head of Research Services since 2011. And Simon has 25 years of experience working in academic and research libraries, including leadership roles at the University of Edinburgh and the National Library of Scotland. And so it's great to welcome back a former colleague and look forward very much to hearing what Simon has to tell us this afternoon.
Thank you, Joe. Nice to see you again. It's been a while. And hello, everybody. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak here and tell you about what we've been doing at the University of Aberdeen. So I am hoping that I can share my screen and that all works smoothly. So with any luck, you're now seeing my opening slide. Do come in and tell me if you're not.
Looks good, Simon. Thank
you very much. So I will whiz through work we've been doing here with Aberdeen City Council. So I'm acknowledging here Fiona Clark, Head of the Aberdeen Library and Archives Service, been very much a partnership and very much about widening access. So I do think it should be relevant in terms of what you're discussing today. So the title of my talk stems from our foundational statement. Aberdeen University has hoped and intended to be open to all, since its foundation back in the 15th century. And we take very seriously our foundational purpose, which commits us to be open to all, to be in the service of others. We're also developing a long-term strategy at the moment, which acknowledges the importance of well-being, of serving a diverse community, and enhancing our various environments. So what we've done with the city has very much looked to the university strategy, which I'll say at the end I think is so important. And then we've worked to a city vision as well, that the notion of a city of learning where all can prosper, and seeing ourselves as very much part of the city, and our role in supporting the city rather than being an institution that delivers higher education, which happens to be here. It's much more, we feel at the heart of the city of Aberdeen, and indeed we don't really have a campus, we are part of a community in Old Aberdeen. So one of the things that was interesting to us, I think, is what we could do to help our students. I think for many years, the main thing we've heard from students is they want libraries to be open longer, they want more study spaces, they're asking for 24-hour-a-day libraries, and we still get some of that. But what we're also getting a much stronger sense of now is how libraries can help students who are feeling stressed, who are feeling anxious. Perhaps we shouldn't be open 24 hours a day because it's not necessarily healthy for the students to be working like that. So there's much more interest in the library community, I think, and in the university community about recognising student wellbeing concerns and seeing what we can do to respond to those. And so this is some of the feedback that's come to us about how they feel in the library. And of course, I very much don't want them to feel like that. So Part of this is about making our services work better for them, but also how do we reassure them? How do we reduce anxiety? How do we offer services which support well-being, as well as make sure our services don't get in the way of it? So it's a relatively modest project, but I think quite innovative. I think in terms of what we've done to bring a public lending library into the building, some of you will know, I imagine, the Sir Duncan Rice Library. And what's been really interesting is in 8 years how much its use has changed and how we've had to reflect on what to do instead. We had a fairly empty space at the back of the ground floor of this building, partly because there used to be a print store here, print shop, and you can see on the right-hand side, which moved, became less important to be on campus, was moved somewhere else, isn't used as much as it used to be. So we still had this empty print shop. And then we had a large space which was occasionally used for things like you're seeing on the left, poster sessions and events, but often it was simply empty. And we thought, you know, it's such a wonderful building, there's so much space here, what can we do with it? And so what we decided to do was to renovate it, make it much more accommodating and welcoming. Think about how it might be a space that was used for relaxation rather than study, but also to offer something else to our students. And it was my predecessor, interim University Librarian Hazel Hutchison, who first proposed that we might think about a public library space. Old Aberdeen, where the university is, hasn't had a public library since the late 90s when it was closed. So we were immediately met with enthusiasm by Aberdeen Library and Archives, and we developed the space both in terms of the furniture, the look and feel, the sorts of refurbishment and refreshment we did of it, but also bringing a public library collection in, which we called the Old Aberdeen Library. And you can see here the members of the project team who worked very hard to transform this and to bring the new material in. So there are public library staff there, university library staff, but also staff from our estates and IT department. So it was very much a partnership, both within professional services at the university and with the public library, the Aberdeen City Libraries as well. And it worked extremely effectively, and the City Library was so helpful and so can-do in their attitude to making this work. So you can see that if you remember the images I showed you before of the empty space, this is what we've done with it. We've got furniture there which can be used to study. We made sure it had charging points. Everybody wants charging points. We made sure it had data connections, but we made the furniture deliberately soft, colourful, relaxing as well. And similarly with the shelving, we didn't want it to look like traditional university shelving. It's curved, it's a little bit more interesting. And we now have a space that has a small public library collection in it, relaxing furniture, and also exhibition space. So if you've been to the library, you'll know we have a dedicated gallery, which we often use for either our special collections or visiting exhibitions from other special collections. But now we have another space here, which we've been using for student exhibitions. So we're bringing more interaction and engagement from our student community. And I'll come on as well to a minute. You can see one of them here, but we've also got museum objects, which I'll talk a little bit about in a second. And this is on the right here, you're seeing the gallery. And this isn't our current exhibition, but at the time we went live with the public library, the Old Aberdeen Library Service, this was the exhibition. And it was the Aberdeen Libraries and Archives staff who came up with a great idea of some of the public library collections mirroring what our current exhibition was. So it was the Audubon Birds exhibition at the time, late 2019. And so the bird collection here was what you saw as you came out of the exhibition if you glanced across to the shelves. So it's quite nice to mirror it and connect what the city was offering to the university special collections, which was a really nice touch. Beyond that, the collection is targeting well-being and relaxation. So it's novels, it's self-help books, it's not scholarly material. It's designed to take the students away from that and give them a break and give them something else and give them support. And as I mentioned earlier, we've also used it as an opportunity to bring in some of our museum collections, our museum objects, some of which were at Marshall College in the city, which is no longer an open museum, so we lack opportunities to exhibit these things. So we brought some of them into the building, which is such a great contrast of old and new for me. So you can see here the Pictish stone on the left, and then the panes of stained glass, which have come from Marshall, which we've hung up around the space, and the colours as the sun comes in reflect the colours of the furniture as well, so they complement each other. So we did think quite hard about the look and feel. And this all feels very strange now, looking at scenes like this, of course. Social distancing wasn't even a term I'd heard of. But this was late 2019. We celebrated the students whose work opened the first student exhibition. And that's the students you see on the left with their tutor. And on the right, what I liked about this was a group of students who just came in, wanted to do a group session, a group reading session, and drag the furniture around, so it worked for them, which is exactly what we wanted. We didn't want to say, this is how you have to use the space. We wanted to say, here's some facilities, use the space the way you want. And they pulled all the furniture around and they got into a group. And the reason one or two of them are trying to look studious in this photo is that I went over and asked, could I take their picture? So they attempted to look scholarly, but they were having a great time, and it was exactly what we wanted to see. And this was just before we actually opened the public library properly. So you can see the shelves are still empty. We were still waiting for stock to arrive at that point. A little bit on usage. I mean, the figures are early days because, of course, we've just got this running and then we have to close the building. But we've had a reasonable amount of use. And what's been interesting is how many people have chosen to request books to collect here to save them going to another library. How many students have been collecting books from other libraries, and how it's helped us understand what the students are interested in. So there was suddenly demand for vegan recipe books, for example. So the city will look at that, they'll review the collections, and they'll refresh the collections according to what they're seeing the needs being. And a little bit of feedback. Generally speaking, people have been really keen to see this, really happy with it, really enthusiastic about it. A few months later, building closed. We still haven't reopened in the way we were before, of course, like everybody else. We're almost back to square one with that space. Again, if you know the building, you'll know there's a cafe at the front as you come in. We've had to move the cafe furniture in order to enforce social distancing when the cafe is open, which it isn't at the moment, but we hope it will be by the end of April. So the cafe has had to move into that space. We've had to move all the exhibitions. We had to move the comfy furniture into storage because I didn't want cafe users spilling coffee on it. So it's back to this. We've pushed the public library collection back. But I have been very, very clear with the cafe manager, this is temporary. He's got this space temporarily. As soon as we can, we will go back to what we were doing before. But what we've also done, because we had that strong connection with the city libraries, we've been able to really promote their digital services and their electronic books, and we see evidence that the students have been using the digital public library, which would have not been as easy to do, and we wouldn't perhaps have thought of it so much if we hadn't had that partnership with them. And we are promoting and bringing that digital library into the building as well as the physical library. So plans for the future, we hope. We hope to move this on aligned with the Aberdeen 2040 strategy the university has now published, to really show how we are building partnerships with our communities. We have some deprivation around the university. It's not uncommon, I think, in large cities. You have universities catering for particular communities, and then you have a very different sort of community around them. And we're really trying to connect with those communities. And a good example is Tillyvrow. They opened a new community campus recently. We want to go there. We want to run workshops and engage with them about what they'd like to see from the library and the university, then bring them in, really start to build those connections with people who see this university, live very close to it, but don't think of it as something for them or something for their children. And we want to change that. And then my final slide, a few learning points. So with this, it was really important to have the vision. I think having a shared vision between city and university was critical, but goodness me, was there a lot of detail as well. So having a project team with the time and the energy to get into that detail was also really important. I think starting small was right. You know, this is a relatively modest enterprise at the moment, but there is so much potential to grow it. But we wanted to get something up simple, quickly, and then learn from it, rather than spending more time and effort on something ambitious when we weren't quite sure how it would go. Culture and change management, often important in projects, that there are real issues to think about if you're opening a public library facility in a research library. You know, and some of my colleagues were concerned, and I hope that some of those concerns will be unfounded by the way we're managing this. But there were worries about hordes of 5-year-olds running amok in the library. And of course, we have an atrium that rises to the 7th floor, the noise carries. You know, we have to think about those things. Being strategic, I mean, we got the support, we got the funding because we could show the university and the city that these were the right things to do strategically. And the city provost and the university vice chancellor jointly opened Old Aberdeen Library when we launched it. So we got really strong senior support. Taking risks was important. You know, as I said, people weren't sure this would work. There's some concern. We thought, give it a go. Let's see what happens. And empowering colleagues to think about solutions and get buy-in so that they were delivering something they thought would work rather than being too top-down about it. And oh yes, you know, if you can avoid a pandemic, that's really helpful. And I'm going to finish just with the statue of Ganesha you see here. It's one of the very heavy museum objects that came in. It was quite something to watch them wheel that in and try and get it on that plinth. And somebody has hung that garland around it. That wasn't us, but we've left it there because I think it's a lovely touch and it shows some engagement with what we've been doing. So, Joe, thank you very much, and I hope I have stuck to time.
Perfectly, Simon. Thank you very much. And that's a really inspiring image and story to end on. Thanks for a great presentation. So as I said before, we'll take questions after the second showcase presentation, which we'll move on to just now. So I'm really pleased to introduce our next two speakers from City of Edinburgh Libraries. So we have Karen O'Brien and Claire Padgett. So Karen is one of 4 library strategy officers within the City of Edinburgh Council, and she's responsible for the day-to-day management of the library's physical collections, bibliographic services, and provision of information and learning resources to schools and nurseries. And she's worked in public libraries for almost 30 years. And Claire is lifelong learning library development leader who trained in community libraries while studying for her MSc in Information and Library Studies. And she currently works in Edinburgh Library's digital team based at Edinburgh Central Library. So look forward very much to hearing your showcase. And now over to Karen and Claire.
Hello. Hello, thank you, Joe. I'm Karen O'Brien. I am a strategy officer with the City of Edinburgh Council, as Joe said, and I'm responsible for the physical collections. Today, I'm joined by my colleague, Claire Padgett.
Hello, I'm Claire, and I work in Edinburgh Library's digital team with particular responsibility for our online heritage resources.
We're going to give an overview of the different ways in which we foster hopefully successful engagement through our collections, both the physical and the digital, and how these are interconnected to form our offer and achieve a wide spectrum of successful participation. Our overarching strategy is to break down barriers between our collections and our audience. Part of the challenge for a public library such as ours is that people often have very firm ideas of what we will hold or what we will offer. So part of our job is to dispel these preconceptions, to demonstrate that they can engage with us in a multitude of ways and at any level. Engagement makes our collections valuable, impactful, worthy of investment, and should inform everything we do. I believe that engagement starts even before there's an express need. It starts by fostering a reputation as an organisation that is welcoming, inclusive and non-judgmental, is open to new ideas and can be flexible. To be successful, this ethos needs to be underpinned by well-managed collections and a well-trained, customer-focused, knowledgeable staff. Reputation established, we need to make people aware of why they would want to engage with us, what it is that we have that they can benefit from. This awareness raising can start with promotional work, the usual billboards, posters, broadcast interviews, social media, talks, visits, events, networking. A huge amount of effort goes into this, both as a standalone organisation and in partnership, either at a local level with schools and community projects, or indeed nationally, and we can see Macmillan here. We have joined the Living Knowledge Network, which gives us access to expertise of the British Library and a growing network of other public libraries across the UK. I think there's about 25 at the moment. We now have the chance to explore new avenues and provide opportunities for engagement we couldn't have offered independently. The rewards partnership working brings can't be underestimated. Here we see an advert for an exhibition we ran in association with the Royal Edinburgh Military Tattoo. It led to a threefold increase in footfall alone during the time of the exhibition. Currently we have items of national importance at the National Museums of Scotland, and that prior to the pandemic had resulted in increased inquiries and research on our East Asia collection. So it's reaching these audiences. This is a way to do it that otherwise they wouldn't be aware of our collections and their scope. Yet even with all this promotional work, with a network of 28 access points across the city with different sizes and range of collections, much of what is available is hidden from view. We can't show everything, but we can demonstrate potential. Our online catalogue is our frontline tool in fostering engagement. It allows anyone to test what we might have, yet even here it does not hold information about all our resources. We still rely on card catalogues, hand lists, spreadsheets. Contributing to cooperative catalogues, retro-cataloguing and enhanced catalogue records are all ways we try to improve the engagement experience and, importantly, the outcomes. The online catalogue will always be a work in progress for us, but it should not be overlooked as it underpins engagement and accessibility to the collections. Yet even with all this work, how do you turn storehouses into meaningful depositories where anyone and everyone can engage on their chosen level and in a way with which they are comfortable? Many people do not automatically feel engaged with libraries. Libraries can be awe-inspiring, but personally irrelevant. They can be difficult to navigate, undermining your independence and confidence as a user. Staff can be seen more as gatekeepers than conduits. And how can you overcome these obstacles on behalf of your communities? We all conform to standards and systems for the description, organisation and retrieval of our collections. Often it is not entirely clear to the public how this works. I'm not advocating we disrupt these principles, yet can we be flexible or creative in terms of organisation to meet a demonstrated need? Can we provide better finding aids, relocate material, or look at different ways to deliver access? For example, we reclassified and relocated material on suicide that was not specifically relating to criminality. It's not that our material was wrongly classed or categorised, but we agreed changes after discussion with interested parties. There was a need to recognise sensitivities around the subject and to remove some of the historic stigma that was being reflected in our collections. It showed we could listen, appreciate our community's need and act on it positively. Sometimes barriers to engagement are physical. In this image, you can see a touch screen. This gives access to our print collection now. Customers can browse. If required, the original can still be fetched for them. Previously, customers had to use sheaf books and complete forms to consult. It was heavily staff dependent, often produced poor results and disappointed customers, which we want to avoid. Addressing cultural, educational, social and physical barriers is intrinsic to our approach to engagement. By removing some of the obstacles in the way of collection engagement, We must be open to creating a participatory culture. It can be targeted events. Here we can see an activity to stimulate a love of literacy and libraries in our youngest citizens. It can be welcoming students and researchers to undertake projects to open up the collections. Here we can see a volunteer project, members from the Edinburgh Fine Arts Society, who are working on a conservation project. Their commitment has now lasted 10 years and has saved countless thousands of prints. The library invests resource to enable all of this work, but this is balanced and indeed outweighed by the participants. The two-way engagement often provides us with extra benefits such as improved metadata. Contributions such as these help to shape our collections. Traditionally, we are the creators, curators, and guardians. Now we need to view collections as a shared enterprise. It's not enough to simply provide resources. We have to ensure they meet the needs of our communities. For us, this may be providing resources in different formats, accepting suggestions for stock, or offering different channels for engagement, such as the digital piano in our music library. A simple solution for those living in shared accommodation or tenements, allowing them to play without disturbing others. It has been so successful that it's now been joined by a digital drum kit. So hopefully that soon have an orchestra. Claire will talk about other digital tools we use with our community shortly. Here we can see the result of a creative project with the Workers' Educational Association, which was stimulated by a show and tell in the library. Its output is now part of the collections. Recently we accepted the Scotland's War printed archive. Scotland's War was a nationwide project to mark the centenary of World War I. By engaging with the organisers and working with them in a variety of ways, we have been rewarded with a lasting legacy, which enhances both our reputation and one of our existing collection strengths. The process of looking to future engagement should be constant. Just as lockdown struck, we were about to hold our first special collections dedicated teenage show and tell. Again, we look not to have preconceptions or make judgments, but be liberal and open to all. As part of our adaptation and renewal post-pandemic, we shall be looking at an appointment booking system for researchers so that they can have a dedicated member of staff to help throughout the course of their project. For even the simplest act of engagement, i.e. the loan of a book, we shall be incorporating a self-service app, and we shall be looking at a much more blended approach to all our activities. Finally, for us, there is still very much a perceived division between the physical collections and e-resources. This slide shows that both are very much interdependent and interconnected. When making decisions about collections and how they can engage with prospective audiences, it's important for us to consider them as one and not two different entities. The pandemic has underlined this. Now Claire will help to show how that applies to our collections in Edinburgh libraries. Here.
Thank you, Karen. Our most established digital presence is Capital Collections, the online image library for Edinburgh libraries, museums and galleries. The prime aim of Capital Collections has always been on enhancing access to our collections. Capital Collections allows our material to be enjoyed outside the confines of the building and to reach a global audience. We have over 23,000 images available on the website, all with complete metadata attached, so people don't have to come directly to us, but quite often find material through Google searches. We have many unique and beautiful images, and I'll be honest, I was a bit in two minds about including this one. It's one of our more unassuming pictures. It does, though, represent one of the key strengths of our local studies department, the Edinburgh and Scottish Collections vast print collection, and that is the enormous number of images which record how the city has changed over the decades. I include this picture, though, to illustrate how people online find connections with our material that we may never even have considered. We regularly have people getting in touch to query data we've attached to images. We'd rather be more accurate, but we are human and we rely on information being passed down from previous library generations. We appreciate it when people take the time to contact us and enable us to put the information right. We also love to hear what the pictures mean to them. Someone got in touch via email to tell us about this picture. The email read, "Was looking at your photos online and I wonder if this could be updated. This photo isn't actually Manderson Street, this is Gordon Street. I lived at number 19 and played in the exact area of the photograph. Suddenly, this view looks very different. It's come to life with this relived and shared memory and shows that even the most seemingly unexciting picture can resonate with someone. The person has become involved in that picture and has staked their ownership of it." These images come from a scrapbook belonging to Sheila Macbeth Mitchell. It tells the story of a remarkable woman who led an extraordinary life. The pictures here depict a chapter in the story recounting Sheila's time serving as an auxiliary nurse on the hospital ship, the HMHS Britannic. But first, let me go back a step and explain how we come to have these images. A few years ago, we started a programme of digitisation of significant items related to World War I, which we plan to make available in the run-up to the centenary of the ending of the war. This material included 2 diaries and a photo album, which had belonged to another nurse, Ethel Moyer, who had served as a nursing orderly in one of the Elsie Ingalls Scottish Women's Hospitals. When we published a blog article to promote the Ethel Moyer diaries being made available on Capital Collections, we were contacted by Jonathan, the grandson of Sheila. He told us, "My grandmother Sheila Macbeth left me her bulging World War I scrapbook. She was a nurse on HMHS Britannic, which was sunk in the Aegean in 1916. There's a centenary commemoration of the sinking in Kier in September. If Capital Collections would be interested in seeing this sometime and copying pictures to add to the special collection, get in touch. I live just round the corner." Jonathan had made a connection between Ethel Moyer's story, his grandmother, and the scrapbook he was the proud guardian of. He drew our attention to an incident we hadn't known about, but also, very generously, offered to let us digitise the scrapbook in its entirety. By digitising, we have helped to preserve the item. Jonathan held onto the scrapbook itself, but by suggesting this digital donation, he found recognition for Sheila, and he allowed us to retell and make available to everyone her incredible story of surviving the sinking of the Britannic. We have another website called Edinburgh Collected, a community-driven digital resource dedicated to living history and which has flourished during this past strange year. Edinburgh Collected is an online archive where people can upload and share their own pictures and memories of Edinburgh. Anyone can browse the website, but if someone chooses to add their pictures or written memories, they're helping to expand the city's digital heritage collections, enabling the Central Library to continue its role to preserve history for the future. And by doing so, the community has the power to create and shape its own collection. Back in March of last year, we realised quite quickly what a strange and momentous time we were experiencing. We wanted to be able to record the effects of the pandemic on the city, and Edinburgh Collected offered us the perfect platform to be able to collect memories from all areas of the city while we were forced to stay at home. We put out messages on social media asking people to help us record the visual signs of lockdown and how their lives had changed. We had a tremendous response and received loads of pictures of rainbows, chalk drawings, supermarket queues, people in face masks, painted pebbles, the sort of things we all became accustomed to seeing, but which last spring and summer were new and alien. This lovely image of this makeshift tenement art space is shared by Orla O'Connor. She says, "Suddenly we discovered the use of our stairwell. It became a beautiful gallery of art for our daughter Cara and son Caelan. It became another room, a space to breathe and communicate with neighbours during lockdown." We're really proud that we were able to utilise Edinburgh Collected to enlist this help from readers who have shared their lived experience of lockdown through pictures and memory. Some of these images are far more meaningful than the traditional leaflet or ephemera collecting, which we would previously have engaged in to record change in the city. My last example is another project which has grown wings this past year in spite of restrictions and closures. The Redrawing Edinburgh project was intended as a traditional community engagement and outreach project, which by necessity morphed into an online programme. For example, the physical exhibition became a Capital Collections online exhibition. Collections handling sessions became online talks. The project, led by Edinburgh City Archives, is supported by libraries and museums and is a collaboration with numerous community group representatives. The group was brought together to commemorate the Edinburgh Boundaries Extension and Tramways Act of 1920. The act meant significant change for the city, increasing greatly in size to incorporate Leith in the north and the Midlothian parishes of Cramond, Corstorphine, Colinton and Liberton to the west and south. Fortunately, our project steering and working groups were newly established, and it was agreed by all to continue meeting online. Gradually, a programme of online talks was begun by staff and has been continued by community groups encouraged to share their local histories. We benefited from the support of our communications department, who helped to create a strong unifying brand, and by maintaining regular connection with the steering group of community representatives, we've been able to bring ideas together to plan activity and have been able to share content across multiple organisations' platforms to reach a wider online audience. The online talks have brought their own challenges I'm sure many of you are familiar with. Research was difficult when access to collections was limited or not available at all, and delivering presentations in a whole new way and environment has been a steep learning curve. But it has been gratifying to see the comments, queries and thanks received. The staff films led the way to contributions from all the community groups. These films and the connections made with the groups, we hope, will last long beyond the lifespan of the project. My final slide gives you the links to the online projects mentioned, so that if you want, you can explore them further at your leisure. Karen and I hope you have enjoyed our talk, giving an overview of Edinburgh Library's approach to collections engagement. We're continually looking to future development and how we can further engage our readers with our collections, and would welcome hearing any of your suggestions, comments or questions. So it only remains for me to say thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire and Karen, for an excellent presentation and some lovely examples of user engagement there. I think to sum up that last showcase session, I think I pick up a phrase that Karen used about collections as shared enterprise, and that probably strikes a chord with many of us, thinking about the kind of things that we would like to do with collections and that kind of community engagement. So we've got 5 minutes for questions for the next presentation, and just looking at the questions and answers, I think the first question is for Simon. A question from Suzanne Cullen. How are items being borrowed using university or public library management systems? And is the collection rotated, and how often? And so Simon, could you respond?
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, the answer to the first question is that it's using the City Libraries system, which is not what we would want to do long term. What we've been talking about is integration. What we would like to see happen is that university student cards can be used to borrow items from the old Aberdeen Library, but we'd also want members of the public to be able to use their Aberdeen City Library to do it, so their City card to do it. So there's an integration challenge which we had started to explore, and like so many other things has been postponed while we're in the situation that we are, but that's the vision. It did cause a few problems because partly because they use exactly the same self-issue machines as we do. So students, not surprisingly, just thought they worked the same way and showed their student cards. So there's been some signage issues. What I could also add is that we've also got a hotline to the city libraries. There's actually a phone which if you pick it up, just takes you straight through to the inquiry desk in the city. So if anybody needs support, they can get it that way. And members of the city library staff are, or were, before we closed, coming in on a sort of rotating basis to support the service face-to-face as well. So more to do there. So it works, but we want to make it more functional. I don't think we've actually rotated the collection yet, simply because it wasn't open long enough. You know, it only really got going in November last year, and then by March we were talking about shutting the building. But the plan is that the city library staff will review what's being used, what's being requested to take to the library, what's being borrowed from the library, and they will respond to the data they see, but they'll also refresh it as they do their other collections. So within the Old Aberdeen Library, we have something called the Healthy Reading Collection, which is something that the Aberdeen City Libraries do across all of their libraries. So by default, we get the titles that they provide in other libraries, and we get refreshed. As far as Fiona Clark is concerned, we are just another library in her system, so her staff will support it in the same way.
Thanks very much, Simon. Thank you. And the next question is for Claire from Alistair MacDonald. So Alistair's question is, when you receive information about a picture, say of a place in Edinburgh, do you undertake any validation? So Claire, could you say anything about that, please?
We don't undertake validation as such. There is a moderation process. So anything that is new that's uploaded to Edinburgh Collected has to be approved before it goes live on the site. Myself and colleagues who do the moderation do know Edinburgh pretty well. So I think if there was something there that we felt was wrong, inaccurate, then we might question it. But to be honest, it's not something that's come up in terms of questioning accuracy of somebody's upload, somebody's memory. Hope that answers the question.
Thanks, that's really helpful. And I had another question as well, which might be for you, Claire, or Karen. So you showed a nice example of someone bringing in a scrapbook and offering the images to be made available for capital collections. So is that a scenario where the person doesn't give you the object, but they're happy to let you digitize the images? And do you have any kind of policy around that?
Yeah, so there was a period where we actually took over what we call digital donations, quite a few digital donations. We had the facility to be able to digitize material, and it was kind of a sort of win-win policy, because it meant that the person, the family, were able to retain that physical item, but they were willing to allow us to make it available. Quite often it would mean that we would publish it, we would make it available, but we wouldn't claim any kind of copyright or sell images, anything like that. But actually, in the case of that scrapbook, the donor is very open to it being used and just made available. So it slightly depends on each donor's what they want to happen.
Thanks very much. Really nice engagement. And then I think we'll take one more question. This is from Patricia Grant. So again, this is for Karen and Claire. Patricia's interested to know more about the platforms you use for the collections, especially community uploads. So if there's anything you can say about that.
So regards the actual platforms, our capital collections, the online image library of our own collections, is hosted by a company called iBase, which I think is fairly widely used in the heritage sector. Edinburgh Collected is a different kettle of fish altogether. That was actually built using a funded a grant fund, so it was bespoke, and it was actually, because of the funding stream, it was built using open data coding. The coding is out there if anybody wants to see it or use it or adapt it for the site as it was when it was built and launched in 2015.
Thanks very much, Claire, and thanks to all the speakers in that excellent showcase session. So we'll bring that session to a close now, and we're going to move on to our next keynote presentation. So I'm delighted here to introduce Torsten Reimer, who is Head of Content and Research Services at the British Library. So Torsten is a member of the British Library's strategic leadership team and is responsible for the development of contemporary collections and services for researchers, research organisations on-site and online. He oversees the library's content and research services strategies, contemporary acquisitions, processing of content including legal deposits, the library's approach to the discovery, long-term access and use of content, as well as related scholarly infrastructures. And if you didn't think that was a large enough portfolio, he's also the library's strategic expert for scholarly communications, including open access, research data and alternative publishing models. Wow. So Torsten, over to you.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction. I hope you can all hear me and see the slides. It's great to be here today. And in some ways, I think I'll continue on a theme that for those of you who have seen me recently speak, that I've been following maybe for the last sort of 2 years or so, which is a little one of sort of soul searching and asking about the future of research libraries. So I'm not promising that I'll have answers for all the questions that I'm raising, but what I'm talking today really was partly prompted by a comment I made, I think, a couple of years ago in a presentation when I said, as part of a wider argument, that one of my concerns about the future relevance of research libraries is that our collections are shrinking, not sort of objectively, but relatively to the growth of the internet. And when I was invited to talk here today, that sort of prompted the idea for the title, and my perhaps sort of slightly self-critical question is, have I accidentally shrunk the library collections and done all of us a bit of a disservice by saying it? And so I thought I'd like to explore this theme a bit further about what does the library collection mean in the age of the internet and open science? Obviously, I don't want to claim that either the internet or open science are new. They've been with us for a while in different shapes. And perhaps to set this in context, what I normally tend to do, instead of dwelling further on a 1980s film theme, is to go into fairy tale land a little bit and sort of take us into the mythical olden days of libraries. And basically what you did is you got yourself some red bricks, at least that's what we did for some of the British Library buildings, and you put up a building, and then you filled it with a collection. And in this sort of mythical past, you could have a realistic claim to say that your collection is so big compared to what else is out there, that it can broadly meet your user needs. I mean, certainly I think for a library like the British Library, you would have that aspiration to say that people just wouldn't need to have to ever leave the building as far as it comes to their ability to conduct research. And I think the same also applies for a whole host of smaller libraries that are targeted on a particular topic, and could very well have, and I think many of them still now have the aspiration to say, we have pretty much everything that you need to know. How far that ever really was the case is another matter, but at least broadly speaking, there were a range of libraries that sort of could make the claim that with reasonable assumptions about their users, yeah, we could sort of meet quite confidently their content needs from our collections in the library. Is this still true now? Now, if you want to assess this, then the first question is, can we actually afford to build comprehensive collections? And we're facing some interesting problems. The number of content that's published commercially is going up. And then we can have an argument about library budgets. I think publishers sometimes point out that library budgets for acquisitions do go up. This is not necessarily true for all libraries. They may not be going up enough to match the increase of costs though, and certainly looking at the British Library's acquisitions budget, it's actually gone down over the last few years, because in a flat cash environment overall, money is ever only going so far. So certainly we, and from many discussions I know many other libraries feel that we are not adequately resourced to build really comprehensive collections. What does a collection look like, and how can we maybe try and conceptualize this a little bit? I thought, well, I'll maybe just look at the British Library and see, can I model the growth of our collections? Now, the problem with this starts with, well, how big is our collection currently? And I mean, you could argue I would be one of the people who should know, but I don't, and I don't think anyone really knows, because what do you class as an item? Is, say, every single patent that we have an item, in which case our collection would be massive? Is every website that we collect as part of the UK Web Archive, every page an item? Huge again. Or is it more sort of the typical publications? So I couldn't really solve that puzzle. And so I went to the fountain of all knowledge, and Wikipedia tells me that we have 170 million items in the collection. So let's just assume that Wikipedia is always right. Where I can speak with a bit more authority is the growth of the collections. And I've sort of taken average numbers for growth of print and digital collections. Print is sort of an average over the last 10 years. Over the last 10 years, we added 7 million print items to the collection. So let's say 0.7 million per year. Digital is 0.2 million per year. These are not, I should be clear, it's not everything that we take in as digital. It doesn't include the UK Web Archive. It includes what I would sort of call publications. I appreciate we can have a long discussion about what constitutes a publication, but I'll just say in a traditional sense. So if you model that, starting at 170 million items last year, then we see there's a nice growth. And yes, this collection is growing quite healthily. It's really big already, so that looks quite good. But then I go back to what I've said earlier. Well, there's this assumption that content on the internet doubles every year. And then you get a graph that looks like this. Now, you'll have seen many graphs of exponential growth recently. I think that was in many ways the bane of last year, to talk about exponential growth of the coronavirus. This one here isn't actually quite true, because I don't know how much content there is on the internet. So I've just said, well, let's just assume the internet last year would have been as big as the British Library, and that's how it grows. And if you look at this growth, it seems fair to say that our collections are shrinking almost to insignificance. Is that meaningful comparison, though? And I would argue it isn't necessarily, because content on the internet is growing. But if you turn to a company that should really know, Google, then you find that perhaps it isn't quite growing in the same way. There is some research done and some assumptions on the Google index, and it's been growing massively for many years. But in the last few years, it's been going up and down, that number's been changing. And overall, it might not actually be growing that much at all. This is, I think, partly driven by even Google realizing what libraries have realized. It's perhaps not sensible to collect everything, but it's certainly driven by Google realizing that lots of content on the internet is spam and duplicated content created by massive spam farms. So in 2019, Google found that every day they discovered 25 billion pages that they class as spam. So clearly a comparison against all what's on the internet to assess how meaningful are we still doesn't quite work. Can we compare against open access content? And there's one way how we can do this. I've just looked at Core, the UK aggregator for open access content. I've taken the amount of holdings that they currently have, and purely based on how they class an item, they've already surpassed the British Library. And for the last couple of years, their collection has grown by about 30 million items per year. So if you project this, then not only are they ahead of us, they will leave us behind quite rapidly in terms of number of items. Whether that's a likely growth is another question, because I think lots of what they currently found is content that's already been published. I'm not quite sure if 30 million open access items are published per year, but sort of based on current items, we sort of get a sense about how content outside of the British Library, relevant content, is growing. We can take this a bit further and look at a number of DOIs overall. After all, not everything that Core collects, or rather, Core doesn't really collect everything that we would class as a relevant publication. If you look at the total number of DOIs created by the DOI Foundation, then again, they've already massively surpassed us. And if you project an average growth, then they will keep surpassing us, although this is also not quite right, because I've taken the average growth over sort of 20 years almost of existence of the DOI Foundation, but I would assume in the last 2 years it's gone up much more. So clearly there's a lot of content out there and it's growing much more than our own collections can. And you can see this reflected in, say, a competitor, or I would rather say a new type of library, which is the Internet Archive. I appreciate many will say, well, Internet Archive, aren't they just collecting websites? But no, they don't. I mean, yes, they collect an awful lot of websites, but they also have, and I've given you here the numbers, publications that rival pretty much any library in the world. So arguably, you can now, within a few years, a relatively short amount of time, build an online collection of content that's as impressive as some of the world's biggest libraries. Now, what does this all mean? And there's sort of a little interlude halfway through my talk. First of all, libraries collect a lot more than what I compared against. So the numbers don't add up on many levels, I think. But one thing that's sort of certainly become clear to me, I'll stop saying content on the internet doubles every year, because it may not, and it may certainly not be knowledge that we feel is relevant collecting. And collecting, after all, has always been selective. That's a good thing in some ways, but also bad in that when you're selective, you might make mistakes and not collect things that later on will be considered valuable. I think that seems to be an interesting lesson that Google's also now learned. So even if you question, quite rightly, I think, some of my assumptions, I think it's still true, though, that relatively speaking to content out on the internet, our collections are shrinking, and that it's unlikely that we can confidently say we need content needs broadly from our locally managed collections only. There's also the question if we say, well, that's fine, but we collect to all the stuff that Crossref has and to all the DOI content, and we point to open access content. Sure, but arguably, do we add value by connecting to open content that's already out there? I mean, we might, but it's not, I think, a straightforward answer to just say, well, let's just add everything that's open access into our search index. That may or may not be a benefit to our users. But what's clear, just sort of looking at those numbers, is overall, if we want to make sure the connections that we have and that are growing, that remain relevant, then we'll have an increased focus on connecting versus collecting. And we've reflected this recently in the British Library's content strategy. We've taken the last year sort of to have a really good rethink of how we approach content, and had broad consultation across the library, and we redefined our content strategy. That in itself would be a topic for task, but for a talk. But maybe you'd like to invite a colleague from my team or myself over next year, so we can talk a bit more about how that work has gone. But we made a few, I think, clear changes and shift of emphasis based on the reflection of the nature of our collection, which is, with our budget shrinking and everything that's out there, we need to be much, much more evidence-driven and be clear that spending public money with value for users. We did this before, but we're trying to sort of move it a bit away from the best personal guess to something that we can really evidence with good hard data, and that we can make a case for the value that the collection is adding to the research community. We've also made a commitment where we say, well, we don't have to preserve content. We generally prefer to connect rather than to collect to content, because we can't meet these collecting requirements anymore. That also means that we want to strengthen and maintain discovery of open access content within the British Library, but also beyond. And overall, a key reason for why we are doing this is to add to the diversity of our collections, and I think have a more inclusive approach than one that we've been able to have before. I've included a link here if you want to look at the full content strategy. It's now published online. So how are things looking like now? And this sort of takes me back to the previous fairy tale example of a library. Overall, I think our own collections, relatively speaking, are a lot smaller. We have digital content that we rent, practically speaking, that we can only give our users access to on site. We have licensed content that's available remotely, and there's a wider universe of open material out there. And there is definitely value to be added by connecting across different collections. And I would argue that as our collections are shrinking relative to the internet, the logical conclusion would be to bring our collections together and make them bigger that way as well. But what we have to ask ourselves is, how far is sort of pointing to open access content really the answer? I've long been sort of strongly in favor of this. I do sort of in a way think, well, if you look around, discovery of open access content doesn't necessarily in the first instance happen in the library catalog. It happens on paywall, it happens with the open access button, and realistically, for most people, it happens on Google and Google Scholar. And it looks unlikely that we'll ever be able to compete with this. So the question is, do we add more content to our discovery systems? Or is a better approach perhaps not to bring metadata and our content out to discovery systems, search engines that others are using, effectively taking our collections to where our users would expect to search for them? What we've seen in libraries overall, I think, in reflection to some of the developments that I've been talking about, that there's been a shift from putting resources into collecting content to building up open science services and effectively help our users build their content and shift from collectors, at least somewhat, to being facilitators of curation and publication of content. We've done this at the British Library for quite a while. We were co-founders of DataCite, and we're running the UK DataCite Consortium. So we're already helping other organizations to manage and share their data assets. And we've recently launched a multi-tenancy open access repository, which we're currently in the process of moving from pilot to an actual service. An open source infrastructure allows us not just to host our own institutional repository, which up until recently we didn't have, at least not as far as open access is concerned, but also an infrastructure into which we hope we can migrate Ethos, the UK electronic thesis service. And we're already hosting repositories of some partner organizations, and we sort of plan to expand that service. And in many ways, other libraries will have their own stories about services that they run. But I sometimes wonder, with some notable exceptions, how successful is this really going to be in the future? And the reason I'm asking is 20, 15, 10 years ago, you could build your own homebrew repository and do something that looks reasonably good. But it's increasingly become harder and harder, I think, to develop new, really competitive software solutions through which we can support open science infrastructure more broadly. User expectations have grown a lot. There's not much more out there in terms of commercial services. So I don't think it's going to be straightforward to say, well, what we maybe lose in collecting activity, we ramp up in open science services, because I don't think it also wouldn't be wise for every library to effectively recreate the same types of services. And we are facing quite fierce competition. I took the screenshot a while ago from the Elsevier website, and it's changed since, but I'm holding on to this because I found it quite interesting. We think of Elsevier as a publisher. They describe themselves, you may not be able to read this, but it says Elsevier is a global information analytics business. So it doesn't say, at least at that point, the word publishing was not mentioned on the front page. And it's quite right, they have shifted. They now, like other publishers, offer services. They invest a lot of money in staff and technical infrastructures in ways that we can't compete, whether it's providing repository services or others. So there's increasingly competition out there for what would be a new role for us as libraries in supporting open science type activities. There's also some competition, I think, in the way about how we're thinking about our collections in terms of metadata management. I mean, classically, you think libraries get content, we catalog it, and we are the owners and arbiters of it. But if you think persistent identifiers and the way how they're all connected to each other, something that's often called the PID graph, where you have personal identifiers like ORCID, identifiers for data sets like DataCite DOIs, linked into organizational identifiers. That is important for all of us, and for many libraries is a godsend in helping with reporting requirements for REF or others. But it's also a significant shift because many of these PIDs are not added bio in libraries. It will be instruments that add them. It will be researchers who share their ID with the publishers and at different stages in external repositories. So we are effectively, I think, as our collections are relatively shrinking, our control over metadata is shrinking too. It gives us advanced and interesting benefits, but increasingly more curation of what we would consider sort of core metadata is actually happening outside of the library world, or at least outside of library controlled systems. The wider environment is one in which, of course, we are all quite active. Now you could say, well, that's all fine, but our library has special collections and they will always be valuable. And that is true to an extent. But one concern I have about special collection is, in particular, if younger researchers, I think what isn't digital, or what isn't at least easy to find in a digital world, is increasingly less visible. And it's that younger generation, I think, that we should engage with our special collections. So the answer that we've chosen for many years is digitize the content, make it available openly under, say, a Creative Commons license, and that's the right thing to do. But it also means when you're looking, say, for manuscripts, Bibles, or other bits, you can come to the British Library, or you can go to the Internet Archive, and they have a good collection of relevant content. In fact, anyone who has the resource to build some really engaging user experience can potentially harvest our content and present it in such a way that users will not come to us anymore. If we consider that to be a risk, to be invisible, then I think there's a challenge for us in improving our user experience and in not thinking about just our own collections, but about bringing collections together more broadly. And that's something that we're involved in a range of activities under the AHRC's Towards a National Collection banner. But I think it will need a lot more than the money that's available there, and a lot more activity to really build a truly sort of global combination, hopefully driven with care and attention by libraries and other organizations who I think share the values of openness and diversity that we have. I think that will be quite important. So our special collections are crucial, but we need to think carefully about how we can give them the visibility that they deserve, and how we manage not to lose contact with our users in that process. And a key thing in all of this, I believe, is skills. Obviously, digital scholarship, digital humanities is one area where libraries have been active, information literacy and training. These are all skills that our users need to make sense of our collections or of content externally. So from a slightly different perspective, I would argue, maybe if our collections are shrinking, our role might increase in helping users, and also those from disadvantaged backgrounds who don't have the level of access, in gaining the access and enable them to have a better understanding of the knowledge that lives in our collections or externally. And more widely, I think, the more we are thinking about collaborative collections, I think we need to think about a truly global, open knowledge environment. At our UK, we've been doing some thinking recently under the Digital Shift banner, under a working group that I'm chairing, working with a range of colleagues. And we sort of set out a manifesto. For those of you who haven't come across it, I've included the link in here. But one of the medium-term objectives that we've outlined is sort of set of requirements for open information resources. And that's something which I hope to get more actively involved later this year. I think we need a consensus what the infrastructure should look like globally through which people discover and engage with our collections. And I believe it should be open, and I believe we should work with our suppliers and not see them as enemies in that sense, but rather say, well, this is what we want our suppliers to provide. These are the open principles that we want to have transparency, trust in the infrastructures, to build inclusive collaborative collections and drive it and focus, I think, quite strongly, not just on collecting content, but on actually influencing the environment in which our users engage with that content. So to wrap up, have I unduly shrunk the library's collection with previous remarks? Maybe a little bit, but I think overall the issue is still the case. Our collections compared against what's out on the internet are shrinking. So maybe a conclusion in there is that we shouldn't compare our individual collections against the internet. we should think about our collective collections and the collective responsibility that we have here. And for that to work, we truly need to connect our collections in ways that are much better than what we've done, create almost like a global virtual library connection. And it needs to be improved usability. I think that is quite critical. And we need to bring these collections to where our users live, not wait for them to come to us, but actively go out to them. For key bits of this infrastructure, I think we need to feature community infrastructures and support all the activities that are out there by organizations and communities that build those, and really actively get behind them and actively fight for an open knowledge environment in which our collections can continue to live and prosper. And we should keep in mind that our strength is partly in our collections, but it's also in that trust and transparency that we have. And the trust that people bring towards us in our collections. So that's a key thing to build on and to be mindful of for any future infrastructure. And it's the human element in all of this, that we keep enabling our users to make the best they can out of our collections, but out of other content. And if we do that, then maybe it doesn't matter quite so much that relative to the internet, our collections are indeed shrinking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Torsten. What an extremely interesting, rich presentation full of loads of things that I've been scribbling notes throughout, and I'm sure that many of you have been as well. So we have got 5 minutes for questions. I'm going to be greedy and take chair's prerogative and just pick up on the, the concern you were expressing maybe about that, the loss of that market share, as it were. I mean, every time I've been in the British Library over the last few years, it's been packed to the rafters, obviously before lockdown. But it's certainly reading rooms seem full, lots and lots of traffic. So does it matter? I mean, if you're getting that kind of footfall and, people are using the spaces, is it really a problem, or can you just let it go?
That is an interesting question. I mean, personally, I think we're here to serve our users with their information needs. And if their main information need is a desk and a good working environment and Wi-Fi, that is a valuable thing. But obviously, we also, I think, as librarians have this aspiration and that strong belief that we add more than just that. And interestingly, we've done some sort of maybe a little bit ethnographic studies. I don't want to overemphasize this, but ongoing user research on seeing what are our users doing. And what we can say is that the amount of users who have content on their desks, digital or virtual, has gone down and keeps going down. And the number of people who come to us for the space and the engagement that they have with others keeps going up. And I think that brings up a question about how we define our value, how we are measured. Currently, I think if you look at Wikipedia, it's ranking the size of libraries by their collections, and that's a very common metric to establish it. And that's also how, to some degrees, we are measured with our KPIs. I think that's something that we need to be mindful of in terms of how we define ourselves. I don't think it's a problem per se, but we need to be clear, what are we measured against? How do we define ourselves, and do we actually meet that aspiration? And I would argue, as long as we're spending money on our collections, we should do this because we are convinced that they add value. And that's something that we also need to track and measure.
Thanks very much. That's really interesting. So can I just ask, has anyone got any other questions? If so, please stick them in the Q&A just now. I think you've stunned people into silence. No, there's a question from Neil Grindley. So Neil is asking, should the difference between scale and comprehensiveness on the web and the smaller scale of libraries pivot around the question of quality? We talk about curation. Can and should that involve value judgments by libraries around collections and acquisitions?
Yes. I could almost leave it there. And as I'm generally known to, if I can give a 5-sentence answer, only give a 1-word answer, perhaps I should leave it there. But yes, I absolutely think so. If you've used the discovery system at the British Library, like myself, you might have been stunned on occasion because you look for something and so much comes back, it's hard to pick out what's most valuable. Now, this is partly, I'm fully aware of this, that our discovery system needs to be better and the user experience needs to be better, and we're working on that. But it also has to do with the sheer volume of content that it's searching. And it's an interesting conundrum, I think, about how we do that value judgment. We can, I think, do this much better now than we could do it 10 or 20 years ago, because we have management information on how our collections are being used. And we've discussed this in the context of our content strategy. And some colleagues got really nervous and say, well, who, if not the National Library, needs to think about future generations and what they might want to do? And so we've effectively agreed that we've said, well, value not just for today's researchers, but also what we could assume that future value is. But you then start to make a whole lot of interesting assumptions and guesses about what is valuable, what isn't. I'm an early modern historian by training, and I think some things that I considered really valuable, libraries at the time considered basically cheap, vulgar rubbish that they only collected by accident. So there is the question of, I think, from a national library and from a preservation and community perspective, what do we collect? And that perhaps should be as broad as we can. And there is the part of what do we make and how do we make it available to our users? And I think a key bit to this is to be having good user segmentation, understanding the different communities that we serve and what they want, and giving them a level of control so that they can tell us what is or isn't relevant for them and tailor it to them. That's easier said than done, but that's perhaps a slightly more nuanced response than just simply saying yes to Neil's question.
Thanks very much, Torsten. And we'll take one more question, and that's from Fiona Ainsworth. And Fiona's question is, received wisdom is that when you digitize material, users want to engage with the original, so you drive up visits to special collections in this way. And does that give you cause for hope for the ongoing value of the library?
Yeah, I mean, to be clear, I'm not waking up every morning and thinking, is the British Library still going to be relevant in 2 years because of the internet? But I think we need to, at every point when we make major strategy decisions, take a step back and think, are we really adding value? What's happening outside? Where are our strengths? Where are our weaknesses? I mean, the same argument, I think, has been made for open access books, that publishers often sell more books after making their content open. I don't want to discard that. I think it's a valuable argument. I've used it against publishers, if you will. I think it's fair to throw it back at me now. One thing I would argue, though, is the importance is to remain visible and for clear provenance information. So if you find British Library content on the Internet Archive, I think that's terrific. And if you then decide you want to see the original, I'm really delighted. And I'll trust the Internet Archive to have that provenance information. I'm not sure every other aggregator necessarily has it. So we need to be, I think, clear that users always know where the content's coming from and that they can trace it back to us. As long as we do that, I have no concerns. I would like the libraries to have a role in platforms through which users can engage their content, because it brings us in the virtual space closer to our users, and that can only be good for our ongoing service and collection development.
Thanks ever so much, Torsten. That's been really thought-provoking, and I'm sure many of us will go away and ponder some of the things that you said today. And we obviously wish you all the best in grappling with these things on behalf of the British Library, and hope we can stay in touch and hear more about the work that you're doing. So we're going to close this part of the session and move on to our final event for the day, which is our panel session on access transformed in the library response to lockdown. So the way this is going to work, we're going to have a panel of 4 people plus me, who are going to each say just a couple of minutes about their experience of the library during lockdown, reopening, re-lockdown, and what we've learned, both the good and the bad, from this last year. So I'll just introduce the panel briefly, and we have a couple of people who you've met already. So very pleased that you're being joined by Janet Orcock, who's Senior Manager at St Andrews, and Sean Convery, Assistant Director at the University of Glasgow. We also have Fiona Doig, who's Assistant Librarian at the University of Dundee. And Fiona is in charge of cataloguing and classification at the Library and Learning Centre. And we also have Andrew McCainch, who's Cataloguing and Metadata Manager at the University of Strathclyde. And Andrew's previously worked in a range of cataloguing roles, including National Trust for Scotland and STV. So if I can ask the panel to assemble themselves, and I can see here they are, they're coming forward. So I'll go around people one at a time and just ask for you a couple of minutes on thoughts on the library response to lockdown. Again, I'll just take chair's prerogative and just say a few things about the National Library of Scotland's experience of lockdown. So I mentioned some of this in my presentation earlier. And I think one thing to say is that we're still evaluating the consequences of this last year. We're not actually out of it yet, it's still going on. For me, one of the things that's particularly interesting is the impact on the collections profile, and that will take some time to establish. We know that some publishers have gone out of business, for instance. We know that some things that were meant to be published have not been published, and equally some things that were published we haven't been able to collect because of the disruption last year. So to give you one example, the paper copies of the Scotsman and the Edinburgh Evening News, we were not able to get those for the first lockdown. So that those paper items are now lost to the national collections, which is pretty sad from our perspective. So that's a negative. I think one of the real positives is that we've learned things perhaps that we never thought we would learn. And certainly individually, personally, I think I know far more about the buildings of the National Library of Scotland than I ever imagined I would know. I could tell you every staircase in our Causeway Side building, pretty much every door. I could talk you through the risk assessments for all of these areas and the associated business continuity plans. So that level of understanding is actually really valuable. And that, I think a lot of our language around risk and planning has matured as a result of lockdown. So these are good things. We can take these back into our longer term planning processes. So that's a couple of thoughts from me. So we'll now go around the rest of the panel, and I'll just pick on people as I see them on my screen. So Janet, you're first.
Okay, can you hear me okay? Yes, I think there were a lot of synergies from talks this morning in terms of what's happened to us. So just some of the services we've offered, clearly digital delivery has just been that big shift, and I think we just had to prepare ourselves for that, do the purchasing, etc. We worked flat out behind the scenes to scan print content that we couldn't provide in any other way, for example, for reading lists, really up to the wire type stuff before we actually shut the building last year, and again once we reopened the building. We're offering a scan and deliver service, which actually we had in place already. We were going to use for our store. In fact, we haven't been able to move to our new location for store. That's another thing that's pending, a big move out to the new campus out at Guardbridge. So we've got the scan and deliver. That's a requesting service through our discovery layer. So there's been a lot of development there to do that. We're offering click and collect. We extended loan periods. We worked a lot on study space provision with booking space basically, and that was a collaboration with other units. I think that's actually come together quite well to look at the total holistic view of study space provision in the institution, not just library spaces, if you see what I mean. We spent a lot of time monitoring student numbers, where they were. We did a lot of scenario planning, risk assessments, etc. In terms of other things, we extended loan periods. We've done some postal services for print stock, and we're just about to start experimenting with actually shipping direct to overseas students new stock from suppliers, which is quite a novel experience for us. And that's going to be very closely monitored, but that's actually I suppose, so much concentrated on teaching and undergraduates. We're now having to really think what we're doing for postgraduates and researchers, basically. And I suppose for me, well, and comms, I suppose, the key thing for staff and students all the time. I think for me, it's understanding where we'll go with our purchasing. Will we return to that level of print that we had before? I mean, that for me is quite interesting. The technology, we're all experts in Teams. I mean, I think that's a given, isn't it? And for me personally, I have not set foot in the building for over 12 months. I have done all my work remotely at home, and it's actually worked remarkably well. So, I think it's just that change in how we'll work, flexible working. We've already started on surveys for whether we want to consider home working as a sort of partially norm for our working week. So it's opened up all sorts of conversations. So that's us.
Thank you, Janet. Lots and lots in there. And I'm going to go now to Siobhan.
Hi, and good afternoon, everyone again. Just following on from Janet, very similar scenarios in terms of scan and send, ramping that up, the impact on reading lists with scanning, and what really reflected, what resonated this morning, what Hannah was saying about an awful lot more fluid and agile working between the teams, and really being able to move activity to where the priority need really was. And I think that the sort of spirit and world we've lived in has kind of catalysed that sort of agility, and I think that's something that is to be welcomed. I might, if I may, just follow on with my special collections kind of element that I talked about this morning, and this maybe speaks as well to something that Torsten was mentioned as well. One of the things that we've been doing over the past year is well, one of the first things we did in lockdown was to look at our teaching commitments and our research visit commitments, and that was our first priority, was to how can we continue to support teaching and research with the collections? How can we make sure the collections remain visible in the middle of this pandemic? We desk research, we looked at technology and kit, we put a business case together, and we purchased visualizers and ceiling mounted visualizer, very high powered one with very nimble and very clever little software. And we kind of branded that as our virtual classroom, collections classroom, our virtual reading room. So on looking to support both the teaching and the research elements. What we did in that first semester was, I'm just taking notes here, 700 students we engaged with in semester one using this technology. So, and we offered for our readers kind of hour-long engagement pieces. So it's a very different type of engagement, different skill sets that we were having to quickly acquire amongst the team, and also to impart those and to get the best pedagogies with our academic partners. So I'm on that, where I'm thinking going forward, I think that's the cat's out the bag on that one. This is that technology, I think, is showing really new tangible benefits. We're in a post-COVID climate change agenda. Travel, I don't think even globally is going to be the same for quite a long time. So a try before you buy idea for distant researchers sitting with the collection, engaging with a curatorial expertise. I think that's something that they will, before they maybe book a visit, I think that's something that's going to be here to stay. I mean, collaborative research, I mean, if we have an investment across research libraries and this kind of technology, what's to say that you couldn't have a booking in New Zealand library and a library in Scotland, and look at two incunables side by side? What's to say that that might not be something that is envisaged? Probably the most long-term impact, I think, though, is on the sort of democratization of and the accessibility of the collections. I mentioned the numbers, the 700 sort of students in our first semester. They were from undergraduate, first year undergraduates, all the way through to PGT. Normally our sessions are very normalized, or sort of very kind of privileged to PGT and PGR. And it's about security and the number that you get in the room. The size of the room doesn't matter anymore. We've got this technology, we can really go global. So those are some thoughts I'm taking forward into our post-COVID world.
Thanks very much, Siobhan. I'm sure there are a few things there people will want to come back to. And now I'll go to Andrew.
Hello. I'll try not to repeat too much of what Janet and Siobhan have already covered. There's so much that we all have in common at the moment in dealing with all of this. What I will say will be sort of focused on the work that I do at Strathclyde. So I work with the cataloguing and metadata team. I should preface everything that I'm about to say by saying that colleagues elsewhere in the library have obviously had vastly different environments to work in the last year as well. So our colleagues in research and learning support and in archives and special collections have changed their workloads and their work capacities in ways that, you know, I've not been in touch with on a day-to-day basis. But talking to those colleagues about things like you know, support sessions that in pre-COVID times, if you run them at lunchtime, you'd get maybe 10 or 15 students coming. and then all of a sudden we're getting easily 100 people turning up to an online session. And I think really there's no going back from that sort of thing. I can't see us going back to a world where we say, well, we're doing our EndNote sessions in person again and they're not going online. That's just not going to happen. But from the collections point of view, as we've moved up and down tiers in Glasgow and the surrounding areas and in and out of lockdowns, we've had to adjust the services that we're offering at fairly short notice. So that's both in terms of the access to the collections, but also in terms of access to the building as a study space. And I think Janet touched on using potentially other areas of the university for study space as well. We haven't hit a scenario yet where we've hit our COVID capacity in the library at Strathclyde, but with a much reduced capacity, that's still it's a possibility that's looming on the horizon with the exam period coming up. Even when restrictions have been eased, we've had to deal with varying availability of staff who previously would have been available for a standard 9-to-5 shift. Everybody's got varying levels of caring commitments, children at home and all that sort of thing. And it means that even during periods when the restrictions on travelling and having students coming into the building were slightly lessened, we were less in a position of being able to just ask staff to come in at short notice. I think the experience of dealing with all this over the last year has, as a matter of necessity, introduced a degree of agility and flexibility into the way that we all work. And it seems inevitable, really, that this is going to have some sort of long-term impact. It's still far too early, I think, to start guessing what that's going to be like. But the very least I can say is that we have demonstrated that vast amounts of our work, even with physical collections, can be done remotely, and we can move our processes around to do parts of the process of acquiring print stock can be done from home, and we've shown that we can depend less on having an on-site presence than we may be used to. We've gone through all the sort of things that Janet and Siobhan have mentioned of having scan and deliver services and click and collect. We're still running both of those. We do also have a problem that I think other universities will probably have as well, in that we had a lot of collections on loan when we shut the building last March, and not all of those have come back. We have a number of different ways that we're trying to get those back, but I think we may have to face up to the reality that some of them are just gone for good. We talked a bit this morning about the temporary COVID-19 collections of ebooks and other electronic resources that various publishers opened up to libraries at the beginning of the lockdown in a, on the surface of it at least, altruistic and philanthropic gesture. Of course, that created a lot of work in getting that into the discovery layer, and the nature of having all that material there available to staff and students is that it created the demand for that stuff to be purchased. So we had to set up workflows for what we do when a temporary COVID-19 title appears on a reading list. How quickly are we able to make sure that we secure permanent access to that? And I think just a sort of closing comment, the experience of going in and out of lockdowns and up and down between levels and sort of constantly having to change the level of service that we're offering and the availability of staff to provide that service has left me at least, and I think some of my colleagues, with a feeling that we need to be prepared to do this again in the future. Things are looking quite good at the moment, the restrictions are being gradually lessened, more and more people are getting their vaccinations, but we just don't know what's going to happen in the future, and we really can't go, marching back on campus at some point later this year or next year and think, well, thank goodness that's over. We have to take on board the lessons and the readiness that we've learned over the last year and be prepared to do something like this again, if necessary. It's a wee bit of a downer to finish on, but I think we've certainly learned a lot about our working processes over the last year.
Thanks very much, Andrew. And perhaps at this point, we should just do a shout out to all of us and our teams for, exceptional work in incredibly difficult circumstances. I mean, I certainly feel that about my own team. The second lockdown has certainly been hard, probably harder than the first lockdown in many ways. But people have shown incredible resilience and agility and some brilliant flashes of initiative as well. And I mean, as you say, Andrew, this isn't going to be resolved in any sort of final sense any time soon. So it is about that long haul, and some of this is probably long-term change to the way that we work as well. So yeah, I mean, we should all give ourselves a virtual or physical pat on the back for having got to this point in one shape. So I think we don't have Fiona Doig, who may be having technical reasons. So we're going to open up the panel for further conversation at this point. So if you've got any thoughts that you want to feed in this, please stick up your hand or drop something into the Q&A, and you'd be really happy to hear from any of you. And I'm going to drop a thought into the conversation just to get the discussion started. So I'd be interested to know what does the panel think about how teams and team culture have been impacted by COVID. I mean, certainly thinking about my own team, I think in many ways the experience has been quite positive because people have had to work extra hard to stay in touch, and the feeling of sort of consciously making the effort to check in with people, check people are all right, making the effort to, when you're doing everything remotely, almost paradoxically, it's actually been quite good for team building. I don't know if any of you have had similar experiences.
Joe, maybe just comment. I think it is very variable, as I'm sure it's been within your own team. I think the greatest impact have been well, not the greatest impact. There's a different experience if you've been put on furlough, you're brought back in, you're put on furlough, you're brought back in. There can be real esteem issues, I think, about the value of people's roles. I think that's something that was quite felt, particularly in the first lockdown. Because at the University of Glasgow, we did put a large number of staff onto furlough quite early on. But I think I'd like to just echo your comments about the innovation and the creativity as well, as well as the deep reserves of energy, which I applaud all my colleagues for bringing to it. But I think it's, without sounding too cheesy, I really do think it's brought out the very, very best in people's professional skills and how they deal with each other. There's a caring mentality which I think is very, very visible, and I'd like to applaud that as well.
Thanks, Siobhan.
Yeah, I think I would agree with all that, really. And I think sort of handling the way you do the communication, I think, across the teams. Thinking of my own sort of smaller cataloguing team, we've kept meetings at a very sort of social level. In fact, we haven't made them too formal. They've been the sort of coffee and cake sort of types of meetings where people could chat, because that's, for people who maybe live on their own as well, it's been quite a sort of social gathering. And then I think across sort of inter teams, in a way, I think it's taken away that sort of pressure of having to be at a meeting and have you got the right people at the meeting, because actually you've got more flexibility in pulling people in, I think, as well. So I think it's just made us more flexible in that sense. And certainly for us, because we know that we're moving sort of 70% of our library staff to a new site, and we're going to be working across 2 sites in the future, which is a big change for us. It's been ideal training and familiarization, really.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the cataloguing team at Strathclyde, we meet as a group now more often than we would have previously. But what we've lost really is that sort of informal, if you're looking for a bit of help with something simple, like, can somebody check this class number is correct for me? That has to be at the very least a message on Teams or an email or something like that. And if people are dealing with other things going on at home, then there's there's less chance that there's going to be somebody readily available to give you their 2 cents on something like that. I also feel like we've lost touch a bit with people from other parts of the library and the Information Services Directorate. So people who your work doesn't cross over with regularly, but you might just pass them in the staff room or in the corridor, and you can keep in touch with what is going on elsewhere in the organisation that way. Obviously that's been sort of lost. You have to make that conscious effort to seek people out and take some time in their day to find out what they're up to. It's a bit more effort to do that.
Yes, I couldn't agree more, and certainly the sense of that casual conversation over a cup of tea or just passing someone in the corridor, I do miss that, and be very pleased when that comes back. So I think we have Fiona available now. So come into this conversation.
Yes, sorry, I don't know what happened, technical problems. I think for us, one of the big worries is that in providing the solutions to the problem of access to resources, we've maybe created an expectation in lecturers and students that we won't be able to sustain. The university invested a lot of extra money for resources, and we've spent a lot of that on Pearson online text and teaching materials, nursing need textbooks, things that we wouldn't normally buy from our budget. And we've also been using suppliers such as Cortext and Bibliu, which is very expensive. And to date, we've purchased about maybe 54 Cortext titles, which have cost £105,000. And it's just knowing how we're going to keep this up if we don't have the increased expenditure in the next semesters. I don't know what other people feel.
Thanks, Fiona, and I'm sure everyone else is wondering what their purchase budgets are going to hold for the next few years, and how we're going to follow through on some of the commitments that are being made at the moment. So I'm just looking at there are a few comments dropping into the chat. Claire Knox commenting, "I've never had to attend so many meetings in my life." I completely second that. I mean, it seems to have got much easier to add meetings, and we'll have to deal with that longer term. And then there are a couple of questions in the Q&A as well. So we'll take them in order. So first of all, from Colin, is the lockdown an opportunity to progress change? I.e., let's not waste a good crisis. What, if anything, have we been able to move forward on faster than otherwise would have been the case? So obviously we didn't want any of this to happen, but I mean, what are the things that we can take from it? Anybody from the panel want to come in on that?
Well, we were just saying, I was talking to my colleagues, and we were saying we were able to transfer from the Talus reading list to Leganto reading list without any problems at all. We just seemed to get it in under the radar and move over the whole system without any objections from staff. And that's been something that we've been able to carry forward, and hopefully renew our policies on resource lists as well, introduce some new policies there.
Yeah, so I think two things I referenced earlier. The ebook first was a policy, but it's now reality. I think that really accelerated. There was no opting into that acceptance. So that's been a big change that we've managed to push through. Likewise, certain departmental engagement with reading lists and that's improved our reading list services as well. Those there, it's accelerated everything. I think it's just compressed the energy into getting these things going forward.
Yes, I think with us it was striking, for instance, how quickly things like Teams were brought in last year. I mean, in normal circumstances, it probably would have had a 6-month consultation and lots of training and staff meetings and development, and instead it was just done within a matter of days. I mean, there were some bumpy patches, but I mean, essentially it showed that we can move quickly when we really have to, and and it's worth hanging on to that. And then a couple of questions from Michael Williams. So Michael says, I mean, in terms of new services, we're talking about which new temporary services will need to become permanent. And it will be interesting to hear how libraries are approaching this challenge in terms of assessing value and resourcing it going forward. So that opens up a whole set of discussions. Is there anyone from the panel want to respond? Which of your temporary services are you going to keep?
I can say a little bit. I mean, I think the scan and deliver, as I think I mentioned, was going to be a service for our new store anyway. I think we've still got to have the conversation, but I suspect that will continue as a service for all our collections, or the certain the amount of collections we can service. Again, it'll be a question of resourcing, yeah, and as Andrew said, I mean, this isn't really over yet, so it'll be quite hard to phase that out in this intermediate period anyway. So that certainly, I think, will stay. We were talking about click and collect the other day in the light of what will happen in April, and you know, we still feel even if students get into the building, it'd be quite hard to remove that service just immediately. So again, I think it's a wait and see game, I think, for some of these services.
Thanks, Janet. And I'm sure that other people will have examples, and I mean, hopefully we'll all be able to stay in touch over the next few months as we start to make these decisions and move into new planning cycles. And you know, it'd be really interesting to see where we all are in a few months, in a year's time. And I think we'll take one more question before we start the wrap up. So this is Michael Williams again. We've launched the Hattie Trust Emergency Temporary Access Service at Cambridge today. Congratulations, Michael. This provides digital access to print collections we hold. Have other institutions considered this? So I don't know anyone else who's considering this. Anyone else in the call wants to share? It sounds like Cambridge may be leading the way. So, you know, congratulations, and you know, we'll be really interested to know how that goes. I mean, there has been a bit of talk about it, and it sounds like a really exciting opportunity. And you know, we'll be really interested to know what you learned from doing that experience and what the uptake is. I see. So Anne Evans has commented. Oxford has made use of this as well. So I think we could probably continue. If we were in normal circumstances, we would probably all now go and have a cup of tea and continue this conversation, or perhaps go to the pub and continue the conversation. But seeing as that is not an option, we're going to wrap this up in a more of a formal way. So in a minute, I'm going to hand over to Robert Ruffin, who is going to formally close the proceedings. But first of all, can I just say a few words of thanks? So thanks very much to all of you who've come along today. We've had over 100 people for pretty much all day, which is fantastic. We're absolutely delighted. So on behalf of the SCURL Collections and Metadata Group, thank you. Thank you to all the panelists. Thank you to all the speakers and everybody who's asked questions. And can I also say a particular thanks to Gillian Daly, who has done a fantastic piece of organisation with this event, and also to Megan Kerr from the National Library of Scotland, who's been keeping the technology working in the background. And without that work, this wouldn't have happened at all. So thank you, and again, please do stay in touch. We'll look at ways to share some of the slides from this conference after the event as well. And final thing from me is that there is going to be a feedback form going around. We'd really love to know what you thought of this event, so we can plan things like this in the future. But now I'm delighted to introduce Robert Ruffin, who is the Director of Library Services at Glasgow Caledonian University. Robert has a long career in libraries, encompassing higher educational, public and school libraries, and he's the current chair of SCURL and also the chair of the Scottish Higher Education Digital Library. He's a past president of the Chartered Institute of Library and Information Professionals in Scotland, and we're delighted that he's here to formally close our conference today. But is he here?
Sorry, Joe, my fault. Robert has now been promoted to panelist. Robert, you should be able to speak now.
I'm always able to speak, it's just people can't hear me.
Welcome, Robert.
So thanks very much, Joe. What I would like to do, just very briefly in the couple of minutes that are allotted to me, is just give a little bit of information about SCURL for the benefit of those who might not be as familiar with SCURL and its work. So SCURL is the Scottish Confederation of University Research Libraries. It's a membership body that supports service development and improvement across the Scottish university and research library sector. And our key areas of work are coordination, collaboration and advocacy. And our membership is all of the Scottish HIEs and research libraries, the two major public reference libraries in Glasgow and Edinburgh, the National Library of Scotland, the National Museums of Scotland, the Open University and the Royal Botanic Garden in Edinburgh. So we coordinate lots of shared service work, and one of our major examples of that is the Scottish Higher Education Digital Library, which is our consortial production group, which began in 2009. Provide a huge benefit to our members in that since that time, and providing access to alternative resources, looking at things like ebooks, journals, subscriptions, learning content and print groups. And other examples of work that SCURL pulls together are, of course, our collections and metadata group. This event, I think I'm probably right in saying, is the biggest attendance we've ever had at a SCURL event, with more than 170 people registered, which I just think is absolutely fabulous. The people have shown such interest in coming along to this event today. Other groups have got our like legal interest copyright group. They held another very successful online event in December with 95 people at that, looking at things like Plan S and publisher copyright licensing policies. So our key aims are improving services for users and maximising resources through collaborative action, collaborate towards the creation of a cooperative library infrastructure in Scotland, advocating for the benefits of libraries to our stakeholders, and providing support for members. And just listening on from that last conversation, one of the things SCURL has been doing is pulling together across Scotland information about how we are coping with COVID, and just the sorts of things that have been just talked about through surveying members and meetings to provide a forum for discussion and collaboration. And just finally, one of the new projects we're working on, which we're very excited about, is we're looking to develop a Scottish Universities Open Access Press. We've received a little bit of funding through the Scottish Library and Information Council to help with that, and we're starting to crack on with that just now. So in closing, I would like to thank Joe for his absolutely excellent chairing skills par excellence. I'd like to thank all the speakers who've given their time and given us the benefit of their wisdom today for a wide range of interesting and thought-provoking presentations. I'd really like to thank our Executive Officer, Geraldine Daly, for all the work that she's done in arranging and supporting this event, and also Megan from the NLS for her tech wizardry. I hope you've enjoyed today's sessions, and I hope that we'll see some of you in the sessions to come. Thank you.